Oh!
The alpha male deity in the Bible reflects the fears, the ignorance, the
alpha male
territorialism, the
deity.
violence, and the patriarchy.
Wait, can we just appreciate that phrase? The alpha male deity. Oh my God. Alpha male omega.
Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive,
See, you know more about religion than you're
ethnic
letting on.
cleanser,
It's pretty funny.
a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal,
God is
filicidal,
canceled.
pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic,
It's so lame.
capriciously malevolent
It's so lame.
bully.
So, like, a much better version of this is a book called Milton's God, written by a literary critic who makes the argument. He says, John Milton's argument in Paradise Lost is to justify God's ways to man. And what Milton's poem shows the kind of his colossal failure to do this, because by far the most sympathetic character in Paradise Lost is Satan. But this guy's not making as
and
interesting
taking
an
into
argument as that.
account
Telling people they support genocide if they support Christianity is not going to make the target audience want to switch. Yeah, I mean, quite obviously not. Yeah. So persuasion is not really what's on the minds here. It's more like embarrassment. The idea of, like, I think that the way that persuasion is being imagined here is like, if I can shame you, if I can kind of like pull off all of your clothes and show the nudity of your beliefs, show how absurd they are, and embarrass you, that's what persuasion looks like. You're going to be naked just like the truth. But it's like, it's also just that this is the most hackneyed version of these arguments. Like, which person coming to this debate who is a believing Christian or any kind of religious person who cares about the Bible hasn't heard this argument before? They've read the Bible. I mean, maybe they haven't, but they probably are aware of this moment in the Bible. So it's just like, surely what you should do is figure out, well, what's their justification to themselves of how that is reconcilable with their own faith. This is not news. And then make an argument on the basis of that. Not just like, because people already resolve this stuff back into their own understanding of their faith.
why does God need arguments? Why does he need proofs? Why not reveal himself or herself to me directly? Is he too weak to speak for himself? He needs somebody like Trent to explain it to us? This very debate is one evidence against the existence of a God.
Oh, that is such a bad argument. This debate isn't... Well, you know what? I'm starting to feel that. This debate might be an argument against the existence of God.
First, let me briefly summarize.
It is interesting to think about this question, though, which I called earlier Theodicy, which is like the justification of God. That's really what dike in Greek means, justice. So, like, how could God be just given these things? And there are changing conceptions of justice in history and in time. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. It's actually particularly interesting to see what very serious apologists do, whether they're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or so on, or Hindu, when there are stories about a deity who is destructive or seems kind of motivated by something that's unbecoming to our sense of what divinity should look like. Sometimes it's allegory. Sometimes it's kind of something that's mystical or arcane, or sometimes it's like doubling down and being like, yeah, it was okay then, or God changes in history. There's lots of different theories, which are much more interesting to think about, and which he could deal with if he wanted to spend the time. You know, he said he's a pastor, but being a pastor doesn't mean that you're like deeply read in your faith. I mean, anybody can go to school and get a degree in this stuff. You don't have to be that. You don't have to think about it that much.
Since there is no coherent definition or good evidence or good
I like the shot to him. He looks
no
so pissed.
Among believers, like... There's no need for a God.
Interrupting
metaphorical.
him a bunch, so
if those are just figures of speech, then the whole Bible could be a metaphorical figure of speech.
Yes,
God
exactly.
Himself.
Yes, in fact, one might say with Nietzsche, a true lover of Christianity, that language is a mobile army of metaphors. That everything that you might say originates as metaphor. But you know, that's just the very pious Nietzsche who thought that. Oh my God, that awful, awful sound. Awful sound.
because nothing can actualize its own potential.
Is that true? Nothing can actualize its own potential? Like, even from the Aristotelian point of view, I don't think that's right. This is one of the things that is true of the soul. Like, the soul is a potential, is full of potentialities, which actualizes itself. I have the potential to read or to speak. When I'm not speaking, it doesn't mean that I can't. It just means that I'm not. And so that when I actualize it by speaking, what's actualizing it? Me, who has the potential to speak. So again, I mean, that seems like a strange interpretation. Maybe I'm missing something.
Any more than it could create itself from nothing. But maybe the universe's motion and change have existed forever. That would be like saying a train car is moving because an infinite number of cars is pulling it, or that a paintbrush could paint by itself as long as it had an infinitely long handle. An infinite series of movers doesn't explain why there's any motion at all, be it in a train or a universe. The train only moves because of something that gives motion but doesn't receive it, like a locomotive. Likewise, our universe only has motion and change because of something that actualizes the potential in all objects, but has no potential of its own, and is just pure actuality. So what is this first mover or changer like? Well, if it has no potential, then it can't potentially go out of existence, or potentially increase in ability. So it must be infinite and necessary. It can't be material or temporal, because that would entail the potential to move and change. So,
wow, I mean, he's just kind of like running through a bunch of kinds of claims, and I don't really feel like he's spending a lot of time substantiating them, because I think he assumes that the audience is just going to accept all of these claims because it's the model of demonstration. But one question I have, I don't know, maybe I'm being dense, but infinite in what respect? So the concept of the infinite, even in theology, doesn't mean just one thing. When Spinoza talks about the infinite, he doesn't mean a kind of extending quantity forever. So, it just means that it doesn't have a limit, but a limit with respect to what? To what property, to what quality, even if we're going to go back into this kind of Aristotelian language. That things could be infinite in one respect and finite in another. And this is also true in mathematics. There are plenty of things that have certain properties that are infinite and certain properties that are finite. So I think it's worth kind of like, if all of this is predicated on a concept of the infinite and like what infinity means in terms of existence, something's existence, we should spend more time kind of establishing what we think.
It must be immaterial. But how?
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand his argument better, because it's the traditional argument of God is the necessary being, which is Avicenna's argument, Ibn Sina's argument. Yeah, but even his way of thinking about that, like it's a being of pure actuality. Is that what does he mean by that? What does he mean? A being that has no potentiality. I think that in certain theologies, even certain Christian theologies, this would be heretical, dare I say, because God must be free. And what is freedom but not kind of pure actuality as necessity, but as potentiality, that even God has freedom. So within the theological debate that's happening here, I wonder if in this existence proof, the way that he's trying to prove it, you get an image of God is it the Christian God that's being proven here? Or is it even an idea of God? Or is it just a kind of formal understanding of a certain kind of propositional outcome of a particular metaphysics, which is a lot less exciting?
The best explanation for why Jesus' disciples preached Jesus' bodily resurrection in defiance of these cultural norms was because it really happened. But perhaps the apostles merely had a grief-induced hallucination. That's what Dan suggests in his writings.
I mean, it's an interesting argument to say, okay, this belief that is propagated by an early community of believers violates the cultural norm of their time. But I think that this makes like a pretty common, I don't want to call it a fallacy. I don't love the idea of fallacies, to be honest with you. But a pretty common kind of looseness in reasoning. The way, and this is not at all something that's unique to people making apologetical arguments about religion. It happens in every sphere that I where you can encounter it in many spheres. Just the argument about a culture being this kind of like monolithic thing. The culture of Judaism in first century Palestine, it was pretty diverse. Lots of things were happening. And there are Hellenized Jews, right? Like Philo of Alexandria, who is one of an important source about early Judaism, or Josephus. Like there are many different kinds of cultural elements and cultural things that are happening within Judaism as a religion, as well as within Jewish practice, including those which are reported in the Christian Gospels between who we now know as the Pharisees and the so-called Sadducees, and the Essenes, right? These people out in the desert. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls who are doing these other kinds of practices. There's so much diversity in Jewish culture at that time and today, but at that time, to say that, okay, well, because there's a cultural norm, anyone who violated it must have some kind of huge amount of evidence. That seems to me just like flies in the face of the complexity of culture and cultural expression. In fact, sometimes what becomes powerful is saying the very thing that goes against a cultural norm, quite like Christ himself does, right? When he's like, Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That's something that kind of is a huge violation for many Jews even today, to kind of violate the Sabbath. Yeah, that's a pretty serious thing. You violate the Sabbath in order to save someone's life, or there are situations in which, even within Jewish law, it is necessary to do that. But that kind of statement was shocking. But that might be appealing to people. They might be like, yeah, I never totally liked that. You know what I mean? It's not totally obvious to me that just because something violates a cultural norm, everyone would be equally kind of repulsed by it. And we see that in our own culture today, that there are plenty of cultural norms, but they're mostly contested. That norms don't kind of produce behavior. They kind of describe behavior under a certain value system. And some behavior falls within it and some doesn't. Usually what a norm speaks to is that there's controversy, or there's kinds of contingency. If something was absolutely observed everywhere by everyone within a certain culture, it probably wouldn't appear as a norm at all. People wouldn't articulate it because it would just be like obvious. It's only at the moment that a norm gets confronted by some other kind of practice that it has to be articulated. But was this a good debate? No. Was this a debate? Maybe. What would be a good debate here? I think that around this question, does the Christian God exist? I have very little hope that a good debate could come around this proposition. Mostly because it's so overdetermined, and what people would expect from it would be like pretty much exactly what we got, where people would like cheer for their team. But I wonder if we could figure out a proposition that would allow people with similar beliefs, or actually, let me rephrase that. People who were religious and people who were not religious would both attend and kind of get something of value that was new. Like that would be an interesting project of being like, well, what would be the kind of debate proposition that would most likely produce something of value? I don't think it would be around the question of existence of God. I don't think that's valuable. I think like even just a slight change of like believing in God makes for a better life. Like, let's take away the question of whether the belief is true or false. I don't think that's going to lead to an interesting debate, because the sources of faith and belief are going to be different than the sources of skepticism. Doesn't mean that they can't talk to each other. Obviously, we just watched it. But I think what people often care about is, even though they think that they're like, if I have the truth on my side, then everything else has to go away. But what they care about are things like what makes me happy, or what makes me kind of virtuous and good, what's valuable. And if we could have a debate about, what's the value of these things, rather than whether it's true or false, I don't know. I think it might be a more interesting debate. What would you think would be a good a good debate about religion that would allow both religious people and atheists to attend and view it? What would be a good proposition?